I'm Dane Rose, and in this video, I will attempt to offer a hierarchical or sequential response to trauma based on my own experience. However, we're each quite unique individuals. There's far more out there. The world is far more complex than we each realize. So if my approach doesn't work for you, or if you have clarity that another approach is better, then I'm very probably wrong. No one approach fits everyone. And the most important thing is to follow the best path that you know, to the quickest, to the most graceful way, or to the most graceful state of well-being. So that's what I want for you, and that's what I want for me and everyone going through the traumatic terrain. And so the first place that I want to start is pitfalls to avoid. So one of the first things when I found myself in suicidal levels of trauma is I thought, well, maybe my family, I just haven't given them enough of a chance to hear and understand, all of this pain that I'm carrying. And so I contacted my siblings sequentially. And they were just as disappointing as they had always been. I looked up a few old lovers, I reached out to people, I tried to talk with clients, etc. And so I think that the first thing to understand is that if we find ourselves in chronic traumatic pain, particularly pain that's been building over time, I think a good working assumption is that neither we nor anyone around us is competent enough to prevent the trauma or heal the trauma. Because let's face it, all it takes is one. I mean, there are certainly a few, unusual situations where it might take more than one person, but if I really knew what I was doing, I would not have participated in trusting the people, etc., that, led to my severe PTSD, right? In other words, I didn't know what I was doing. And the people I trusted didn't know what they were doing. And the people I tried to talk to about it, didn't know what they're doing. And what I'm getting at is, as a general rule, our culture is capable of inducing intensely painful traumatic events at a certain regularity in most of its members, whether it's the American culture or the British culture or, you name it. We're good at causing massive amounts of traumatic pain to the majority of our people, and then largely leaving them alone with incompetent recipes for responding to that, leading to massive amounts of addiction, pain, shame, failure, disease, and at times death. Well, that's not a very intelligent culture. An intelligent culture would precipitate or prevent most of these traumas before they occurred, and would educate people about trauma so that we all knew how to respond, and would not shame and blame the individuals for the symptoms of the culture's lack of response. But we are not a very intelligent culture. and so I would say that one of, it's one thing if it's kind of, you're in a car accident. We're pretty good with that type of physical trauma. Like if your body parts are laying around the road and you need to get to a hospital, we're pretty good at calling 911. We've got that down, and we've got ambulances showing up and all of that. Now, the medical trauma, the psychological trauma, we're terrible at that, right? All the beeping lights in the hospital and stuff like that. So I guess in stage one, what I think is important to avoid is expecting anyone to know what they're doing, either us or anyone else, and then getting re-traumatized and upset when one person after another doesn't know what they're doing. And then either we blame them and then they punish us, or there's, that can be an endless cycle. And so I'd say that the first thing is to avoid certain pitfalls. Another pitfall is, expecting that it will just, clear up. It'll be no big deal, which is often what the culture hopes, because it doesn't know how to respond to trauma. So it would be very nice if it just magically disappeared. And that's not very likely to happen. Now, if we grasp those two things, that 90% of the people we reach out to, whether it's family or friends or coworkers, that they will not know how to respond with the level of empathy, with the level of competence necessary, and that we realize that that's not personal. They don't know how to respond to their own trauma. They don't know how to respond to mine, et cetera. That can save some issues. And, in my case, I went through several communities, several therapists, and several, family members and stuff before I realized that the people around me, including therapists, lacked the empathy, the competence to respond in the way necessary to make me feel human, to make me feel like people actually got what this felt like. And so, so that's, that was definitely a big pitfall. And in some ways, reaching out and expecting other people to actually know what they're doing or make amends, et cetera, escalated the trauma, because their response was so sociopathic and so crazy-making, it left me feeling more alone. And so I think that in this culture, in Western culture in particular, where there's actually an indirect shaming of anyone who has intense feelings, or a direct shaming, I think it's best not to ask much or to expect competency, and just to assume that the level of incompetence that participated in with causing and allowing the trauma that you're in is not capable of responding to it. So that, may be useful for you. I would say doing it over again, I would not involve people, or I might say in other ways, I wouldn't involve Americans. I wouldn't ask Americans to respond to trauma. Now, dogs are another matter, right? If you have a dog or willing to get a dog very well may give you, 500% more emotional and physical support going through trauma. So Americans, not so much. Dogs, definitely, right? So I would avoid that. Now, I think that, the very first step particularly if it's a physical trauma in terms of a house burning down or an accident, whatever, is to analyze. Is there any reasonable step that you can take to mitigate the long-term harm? Anything along that line, absolutely. Calling in my credit cards are lost, asking a friend to go make a list of logistical things that need to be done. Anyone you can ask, basically, to cover logistical things. And there again, you may find that there's an incredible amount of incompetence. That's not my policy. That's not this. It's very crazy making. But nevertheless, respond logistically to mitigate long-term harm within your ability, right? So that's step one in a trauma. Is the house locked up? Here are the keys. Is my dog fed? Anything like that. Kind of go through a checklist and make a list of anything that you can do and do it. Next, I would say that you are likely to be more traumatically illiterate than you know. And you may also not be in the best frame of mind to read books, right? So where I would go to is Audible. It's the biggest online library of knowledge on the planet, so far as I know. Just buy the 20 or more books a year subscription, and that brings them down to $9.95 a book. And plan on learning a lot about trauma, PTSD, and psychology. Because there's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot that we don't know that we don't know. And I was fortunate or unfortunate, having done tremendous amount of therapy, some of which made trauma worse. Most of it just didn't address it as the key issue, and some of it helped a bit. None of my therapist educated me about trauma or PTSD or complex PTSD or gave a diagnosis or referred anyone useful. And so I spent a lot of money going around in circles. And luckily, a stranger in a cafe showed up and told me about trauma. So, I'll be your stranger in a cafe. I went home and I began reading The Body Keeps the Score and Healing Trauma by Peter Levine and Complex Trauma by Pete Walker and, on and on. And, just stunning all the things that I didn't know, and then stunning all the things that my therapists didn't know and didn't know that they didn't know, and teachers and parents and all that. And that's nothing personal. You're living in a traumatically illiterate cult that is committed to avoiding anything in a traumatic terrain by just pretending it doesn't exist and not talking about it and keeping secrets and hushed voices and all the things that you would have to do to keep very useful knowledge invisible to an entire population who desperately needs the information. Now, the next thing you might consider, and that I did, if you have the ability, and first of all, I would say part of a chauvinistic paradigm change that you may find useful is that any amount of money is worth spending to relieve suicidal levels of pain. I mean, certainly if you are dead, it's not going to do you any good. But even if you're not dead, reducing traumatic pain is going to give you far more well-being than a house that's twice as big or a car that, or two cars or whatever it is, or a plane, or, and so it's a little bit insane that people might hesitate to spend $100,000 if it could make a difference in, relieving 2 years of hell, for example. And so I was fortunate enough to have a little bit saved up. And so I found the United States somewhat toxic in its apathetic response to extraordinary pain. It just worked me up every time I would talk about something and someone would change the subject or move on. I just thought, I am in a nut house of sociopathic morons. I've got to go somewhere. And in my travels around the world, I had learned that in the Philippines and also in Thailand, there's a lot more focus on the feminine side in both men and women, on engagement, on empathy, on presence. And so I got myself to Manila and ended up somewhat training and participating in energy work / massage. And, I just tried 20 masseuses, and one of them, as soon as they touched me, I felt incredibly calm. So that's worth a lot. So I did 2 or 3 hours a day with her of, just touching, massaging, and meditation. And since she wasn't very familiar with the energy work paradigm, I introduced her to it, taught her about grounding and how to kind of clear my energy through her body. And, that reduced half of my pain. That was another thing. Now, another thing that I found useful was talking about the experience. Like, that's when I wrote or made the very first videos for this channel, is I thought, I don't know where I'm going with this. I don't know if I'll get better or not. I don't know, but I'd like to record the journey because I feel incredibly terrified and incredibly alone. And that means there are millions of people feeling incredibly terrified and incredibly alone and not knowing what they're doing. And I don't want to perpetuate that isolation and loneliness. So I made videos so that, you and others watching these videos would not feel as alone as I did. Because if there's two, you understand that you're not alone, right? And so I started making videos because it was too hard and painful to write. And of course, I'm not trying to be perfect. I'm just trying to get out as much as I can think and feel. And so I found that, a purpose of service and a purpose of including others and, I think a purpose. Any pain is bearable if you have a good enough purpose is what I'm getting at. And the purpose of providing to other people what nobody had provided to me by sharing as candidly as possible exactly what it was like to go through this and why, for me, offered a purpose. But it also offered a challenge, meaning there are times when loving other people is easier than loving ourselves. And the fact that I was trying to explain to others what I was going through meant I talked and sorted through the ideas more clearly than if I was just trying to teach myself. And so trying to teach what you're learning is a possible or a probable pathway to integration and purpose, which is useful, right? And so I found, that to be a useful technique. Around the same time, I also met a woman who, as it turned out, had been through a tremendous amount of traumatic abuse. And since I had read The Body Keeps the Score and several other books by that point, I understood her symptoms and I understood what she was going through. And in her case, all she needed was sanity and hope and a little direction and a little money. That's all she needed to break out of a lot of her cycle. And so I realized I could give her all that. I gave her a book to read. I talked with her. I validated her feelings. I bought her a tablet she could write and draw and do work on. I taught her a few techniques, including inner child meditation. And she just took off because all she needed was that. And she just never encountered that in her entire life. And that also gives purpose, but it gives hope, right? To watch someone else take off and blossom gives hope and purpose and joy. And so, for me, the choice to be the person that I wanted, because at the time I was very bitter that no one was doing that for me. No one was asking, how can we help? No one was understanding the dynamic. People were just doing their little things, right? This is my job. That's my lane. That's what I'm doing. And, you're just there. This is incredibly maddening. But, one of the things that I find is medicinal is to be what I'm furious doesn't exist. Now, it's sometimes tricky, right? So it's a balance. But in my case, I found that the happiest moments of my day, which were filled with misery, the happiest moments of my day became being a kind of a friendly guide to this woman that I had met with no other purpose than to take a stand that, human beings can actually care for one another if they want to, and I want to, right? I want to live in a world where people do that, and so I'm going to be that for her. And it also helped validate, watching her just take off and blossom, validated something that I instinctively knew. I knew that I needed only one competent person to do for me what I was doing for her. It's different, because I didn't need money and stuff, but I needed someone to understand and empathize and talk with and stuff. And America and me could not produce one person to do that under time pressure, right? I'm sure they're there. I just couldn't find anyone. That's not personal. We do not produce traumatically literate, highly sensitive, highly empathic people in any abundance. We're talking less than 1% of the population. But, for the 70% of the population that's going to go through a major trauma, whether they can get in touch with that 1% when needed, and if there's any facility to accommodate that is a question. It's an unknown. So getting myself to Philippines and then to Thailand was useful because there it's maybe 5%. So I have a 500% higher odds of encountering traumatically empathic sensitivity. And so, it's just improving the odds. And the culture and the natural beauty and the warmth and all of that is also a lot more beautiful to me. And so, that's part of pain management. Now, once I got the pain down a little bit and gave myself a constructive purpose of helping someone else and was starting to read the traumatic literature, I still wasn't in. I was in too much pain to not need some other way of numbing the pain. So I did it in two ways. One is jet lag, by staying up all night and sleeping all day and changing my sleep rhythm. You can induce a dissociative jet lag in the same way that people do when they try to drink themselves into dissociative numbness, right? To blot it all out, right? So dissociative jet lag from playing with sleep, I prefer that. So what I would say is that, you may be in a level of pain that requires an addiction, that requires a chronic dissociation to manage it. And again, luckily I wasn't having to work, so what I want to encourage you to do is avoid something like an opioid, and or a fentanyl or something like that, and pick an addiction that has minimal long-term effects. Staying all night, up all night, and sleeping all day. Minimal long-term effects, It's not hard to break that addiction. What's hard is to reduce the pain to the point where I want to come back in my body. And so try and pick an addiction, a compulsion, that has minimal long-term side effects and that might even be useful, right? So making videos, I did that somewhat compulsively, right? But what comes out of that is I'm a little bit more aware of what's going on, and there's a little bit more educational material out there. So that's a better addiction than cocaine, for example, right? Making videos doesn't cost anything, et cetera, et cetera. I also picked overeating. When I had this horrible ache in my belly that I couldn't deal with, I would overeat deliberately. It's like, I'm going to eat until this ache goes away. Now, there again, there's more harm to the body with overeating than jet lag and that type of thing. But it's less than, an opioid addiction, right? You're not going to overdose on food. And so the sugar is hard on the body. And I did put on 20 pounds in the process of that kind of stuffing, basically. But it, as I say, it's a better addiction than something else, right? Pornography, again, there's a cost because it can be dissociative. There's also a cost if you make up a bunch of stories about it, right? If you just say, I'm looking for some adrenaline, and I want to bring pleasure and endorphins into my body to help give me something to distract from all this pain. And this is available, it's free, it's, there is a story around, is it harming the women, et cetera. But I think that there's far more damage in shaming people around sex than there is in, prostitution or pornography type things itself. Meaning, I think the real harm to, for example, women is a cult that looks down on them for selling services that bring pleasure to themselves or others, rather than selling services that bring suffering, right? Because nobody looks down on people that sell nuclear weapons. Oh, you're so disgusting. You sell nuclear weapons. You're worthless. I would never marry someone. There is some of that, but it's, when you consider, or someone who sells herbicides, that destroys rivers or whatever, or drives around in a truck, with doing jobs they don't like, and with products that nobody thinks that's a problem, right? But you do something to bring pleasure to the body, and then we as a cult decide in a very cult-like way to shame that, and that I think does more harm than someone having the freedom to decide how they make money, as long as there's consent and honor, that you see there's a human being there, right? So anyway, my point is eating, pornography, and a certain amount of travel and movement, etc. Making educational videos, listening to books, writing things down, listening, moving restlessly around, going out for late night motorcycle rides. These are all kind of compulsive things. I need something to distract me from pain. Massage was not so much an addiction or compulsion. Very present massage with quiet music, etc., brought me to a point where I could tolerate to feel more of my feelings as deep muscles were pressed. And so sometimes I would talk into my phone to kind of record deep thoughts and feelings, and other times I would listen to Audible while having a 2-hour massage, once a day. And, that also, brought pleasure and healing. Giving gifts was another thing. I might bring some food for the masseuse. And in Thailand, it's a very social framework. And so, this was a delight. It was a delight to watch their delight at, receiving gifts and presents and food and things like that. So, this is medicine to extraordinarily toxic levels of suffering and grief. So, that's kind of moved into a period. And, then I started looking at the future. I did little projects, meaning it was so easy to just fixate on the pain. So I would try and give disciplines, like I did a 30 minutes for 30-day challenge. So every day for 30 minutes, I'll try and do the most good for the most amount of people with $30 in 30 minutes, right? And so I cleaned up a beach of garbage. I gave someone a dental cleaning. I talked with people. I gave, gifts. I did various things with $30 in 30 minutes for 30 days. And I recorded all that and made a little series of it. And things like that give a positive purpose so that it's not all I wake up in absolute agony and don't want to get out of bed. And then I just stay there in absolute agony with nothing to look forward to. So having a structure. Now, later on, I formed, at first it was just way too much pain to have any structure, and I didn't want the pressure. But later I found that a routine where I could say, like, for 4 hours a day, I'm going to do intelligent, organized stuff. And then the rest of the time, I'll just addict and pain manage. That was useful because, it wasn't too much. It wasn't 8 hours a day of an unmet. It was 4 hours a day. And then later it's my current routine is probably about 90 minutes. Meditate in the morning, take a hot bath with Epsom salts, bond with my wife, deal with, do some writing and deal with my clients, and write or make a video like this. Do something creative. That's it, right? It takes about 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours or whatever, and I just check off every single day. Have I done that? And if I do, I'm like, that's a successful day. And so that's so things in that nature. Bringing in lots of fresh flowers. a vase of pink tulips, a vase of roses, like 1 to 3 fresh vases at any given point, just brings a sense of beauty and delight. Putting waterfall images on the big screen TV, so that there's just beautiful scenes in nature, also has played a very valuable role. Microdosing, San Pedro cactus or psilocybin mushrooms is another thing that has, and by microdosing, what I mean is there's no visual change, like I'm not seeing spirals or anything like that. So we're talking under a gram of dried mushroom, and I'm not sure what the dose, the weight would be of San Pedro, but microdosing can bring 75% release of kind of pain, the terrified, lonely part, that's kind of working its way through from the unconscious of our culture into us as individuals, and learning how to love and be an adult to care for that little one. Microdosing helps with that. And so you can look up, there are some places in the US and around the world where that's legal. And there's, unfortunately, many areas where it's illegal. But microdosing was and remains an important thing. Starting a nonprofit was something that brought purpose. I started happinessdata.org, and using LegalZoom and my virtual assistant, we got a nonprofit started for like $200, and if you do it in Delaware, it just needs one director. And so I donate, so that gave a purpose to then want to make money. And so I make money in my landscape company and donate it to my nonprofit, which then is a tax-free haven. And then I can do things that I believe in, including invest in companies. Like I really believe in Tesla as a force for good in the world. But I don't want to raise money. I don't want to run a nonprofit and have to go around and ask people for money. And so I've put an investment account for Happiness Data, and I donate money. I invest in Tesla, and then that grows so that when I need money for a project that I think is important, then that I can sell some shares, and with that model, the investment fund creates an endowment basically for the nonprofit, and I don't have to ever look forward to asking people for money. So that's doing things like that, which I didn't really know how to do initially, but as I had ideas, I'd give them to my virtual assistant and say, find out, can we do this? Can we do that? Can we do this? And so, that's really exciting, to see that fund growing, and realize, that in another 10 years, I'll have a good chunk of money to do some good in the world. And, so that creating a future that's worth living for, I think is important. Learning skills generally, I think is important. Blaming and shaming my abusers was a definite useful step, meaning for a whole year or so, I read every book I could on sexual abuse, on traumatic abuse, on PTSD. And every time I saw something that my parents and my teachers and my therapists and my sexual abusers had done wrong, I made a note of it. This is why I'm in so much pain. They did this wrong, then they did that wrong, then they made it worse with this, then they made it worse with this. And I would, make those little montages to show how wronged I had been, how fucked up the cult was, how fucked up my family was, all this stuff. Because, what a dysfunctional and ignorant cult likes to do is look at you with a straight face as if, why are you in pain, right? We've only sexually abused you, lied about it, shamed you for bringing it up, shamed you for having feelings about it, left you in a depressed state, bullied you, then told you to go get a job in that state, then bullied you and shamed you some more for not doing better than you did. That's all we did for 30 fucking years. Why are you upset? What's the big deal, right? Why aren't you happy, thanking us for all of our abuse? And, that just felt too, no one has talked about all this. And so I decided I was going to talk about it publicly on YouTube and all these things. And there's some adrenaline and blame and shame and righteousness and condemnation and all of that. And so I think there's a part of, there's a constructive part for that. As particularly as I've been figuring out, well, what do I do? Now, that's the adolescent stage of kind of healing and growing, because the adult stage looks at the fact that, I may have been surrounded by sociopathic and dysfunctional and ignorant and whatever people, but I didn't know how to do a better job than they do, right? I didn't know how to get born to a better family. I didn't know how to do better things than I did. I didn't know how to stop this abuse. I didn't know how to stop that abuse. And now I don't know how to feel better with all of this stuff, right? So in other words, dysfunctional cultures breed dysfunctional individuals. But I am a part of a dysfunctional culture, right? And dysfunctional cultures don't change. If they did, they wouldn't be dysfunctional, right? If all the culture required is someone to say, you did this, and they said, you're absolutely right, here's a $500,000 award, we so apologize, how can we help, and let's have a party, right? That would be a great culture, right? But dysfunctional cultures don't respond functionally to their abuse, right? So instead they say, well, we're not talking to you anymore, and that's not true, and you're exaggerating that, and we're not giving you any money, and go away and stop whining and blah, 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 right? So dysfunctional cultures are dysfunctional. They make it worse when you try and bring this stuff up, which is, to be expected in a dysfunctional culture. But to expect a dysfunctional culture to be functional is dysfunctional, right? So what I'm getting to is, after all the venting, and take your time and do list, all of the many, many grievances. But ultimately, it's not going to change unless you can figure out how to be functional, surrounded by dysfunctional role models in a culture that is dysfunctional, right? And if you can figure that out, then your intelligence exceeds the culture. But if your intelligence doesn't exceed the culture, then it's not them that are stupid. It's we that are stupid, right? In other words, we're not really talking about how cruel and dumb and stupid they are. We're also cruel and dumb and stupid because we couldn't stop the cruelty and the stupidity with the level of intelligence we were given, right? And blaming stupid people doesn't usually help stupid people, right? So then the question is, well, can I do anything to make the culture a little bit less stupid and be a little bit less stupid myself in the process? So that's, well, it's not fair. Why should I have to fix myself and then help this, right? So there's a whole bunch of that. It isn't fair, right? It's just the only thing that works, right? And so that's the difference between adolescents and adults. But our culture doesn't raise adults, so we're not likely an adult, right? I've somewhat learned what an adult is during this whole process and somewhat learned how to be an adult some of the time. And I'm, of course, furious that everyone else is not an adult all of the time, and that they didn't figure it all out better than me and before I was born and, et cetera, right? Anyone can grow up and be a grown-up, but to actually be an adult and know what you're doing and have compassion and empathy and, show up as a human being, that isn't taught in high school or college or work, right? It's just left to be bumped into from time to time. So that's there's a movement, there's a place for blame, there's a place for self-pity, there's a place for hate, hatred and revenge to get off and tell the story and stuff can be useful when you're laying on the floor and can't move, right, to get off. But it's also corrosive, right? And so if you can motivate yourself with hatred and rage and righteousness to a point in your reality where you're in a lot less pain, then you don't need the hate and the rage and the righteousness. And it's not as fun as gratitude or dreaming about the future, et cetera. Those are more fun than, right? Which is obvious, right? But if you're in massive amounts of pain and hatred is available as a motivating tool to get something done or do whatever, or prove something, then get out of bed and use that energy and appreciate it. It's there in your body because there is a time in our history and there's a time in our reality where all energies have a purpose, where they helped us survive. And so it doesn't work very well to be judgmental, but there are plenty of people in an emotionally and psychologically illiterate culture who will judge you for hating and judge you for seeking revenge. I would say just use those energies in a general direction that somebody benefits, right? You benefit, or people in general benefit. Going after my sexual abuser, for example, what stopped it kind of dipping into just, pure dark energy was having the highest focus on other victims of abuse. Like, what's good for that abuser's next victim? Because I'm not the only one, right? So how do you get this person out of a powerful therapeutic position, et cetera, and into this so that other people are kept safe? And so in that sense, the vision of caring and wanting a better future for the culture, for the world, and the hatred and the rage at what was unjust and done can combine to create, a generally constructive direction, right? Because it's a difficult problem to solve because our cult is raising pedophilic abusers every day, right? We're producing them faster than we're knowing how to heal or prevent abuse. So just, shooting the ones, that are there isn't, the problem. The problem is, well, why isn't this being taught in school? Why don't parents have to take a course before giving birth to a child? And what would that course look like, right? How do we stop raising chauvinistic, pedophilic, narcissistic, sexual abusers in positions of power? How do we do it, right? Does anyone care? How do you do it in a culture that doesn't care and doesn't want to talk about it, right? Well, how do you get people to care? These are tricky they're tricky questions. And they're maddening, to be in a tremendous amount of pain and be met with stone walls of apathy. Oh, we don't think this is a concern. You goddamn motherfucker. How much pain do you have to be in before it gets to be a concern, right? Are you so sociopathic, right? But we're surrounded by stupidity, numbness, and sociopathic behavior. And that's a crisis. Like, how do we deal with that? And to me, I talk about it, right? This is not yours alone to deal with. It's not mine alone. If we don't love ourselves enough as individuals, we don't love ourselves as a cult. If we don't love ourselves enough as a cult, with a protocol of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being somewhat functional, we don't raise individuals that love themselves, right? It's a chicken and egg dynamic. What do you do with it? My dog raised energy 25%, so I highly recommend getting a dog. I think that covers most of the journey. Yeah, I think that covers most of the journey. I was able to write a few books after making the videos for a while. It was just too much work. I'm now getting to the point where I can edit, because that takes even more focus and presence in the body. Anyway, in the comments below, I'd love to hear what's worked for you. And just as importantly, other people, share what's worked for you and what hasn't worked for you. And maybe it'll help someone. Thank you.